For Emancipation Day, in honor of a life well lived, I'd like to begin this week's reflection by reading the words of U.S. Congressman John Lewis, whose funeral was this past week. If you don't know John Lewis, I hope after this you do some research on his life. He was born outside of Troy, Alabama on February 21st, 1940, and he died on July 17th, 2020. John Lewis lived an extraordinary life. He was instrumental in the civil rights movement, was jailed and arrested over 40 times, beaten mercilessly by authorities, and continued to advocate for nonviolent resistance as a way of true social change. Most memorably, he led the walk over the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, remembered today as Bloody Sunday. John Lewis was a central figure in ending legalized racial segregation in the United States in 1964. He rose in authority and influence, eventually becoming a congressman in the state of Georgia. In honor of John Lewis's life and what it can teach us about being a disciple of Jesus, I'd like to share a powerful short story from his childhood in his autobiographical book, Walking with the Wind. Now, about 7 months ago, I read this story to the Windsor Mennonite community right here in this room, not expecting the subsequent events of 2020. And now, in light of a global pandemic, extreme political and religious divisions, global protests for racial justice, and the rise of media disinformation, and living in times of collective fear and great uncertainty, I think John Lewis's words are more relevant, hopeful, and necessary for us than ever. Walking with the Wind by John Lewis, a prologue. I want to begin this book with a little story. It has nothing to do with the national stage or historic figures or monumental events. It's a simple story, a true story about a group of young children, a wood-framed house, and a windstorm. The children were my cousins, Roy Lee and Ginny Boy, Naomi and Leslie and Willie, Muriel, about a dozen of them, all told along with my older sister Aura and my brothers Edward and Adolphe, and me, John Robert. I was 4 years old at the time, too young to understand there was a war going on over in Europe and out in the Pacific as well. The grown-ups called it a world war, but I had no idea what that meant. The only world I knew was the one I stepped out into each morning, a place of thick pine forests and white cotton fields and red day rocks winding around my family's house in our little corner of Pike County, Alabama. We had just moved that spring into some land my father had bought, the first land anyone in the family had ever owned, 10 acres of cotton and corn and peanut fields, along with an old but sturdy 3-bedroom house. A large house for that part of the county, the biggest place for miles around. It had a well in the front yard and pecan trees out back and muscadine grapevines growing wild in the woods all around us, our woods. My father bought the property from a local white businessman who lived in the nearby town of Troy. The total payment was $300 cash. That was every penny my father had to his name, money he had earned. That way, almost everyone we knew made what money they could in those days by tenant farming. My father was a sharecropper, planting, raising, and picking the same crops that had been grown in that soil for hundreds of years by tribes like the Choctaws and the Chickasaws and the Creeks, Native Americans who were working this land long before the place was called Alabama, long before black or white men were anywhere to be seen in those parts. Almost every neighbor we had in those woods was a sharecropper, and most of them were our relatives. Nearly every adult I knew was an aunt or an uncle, every child my first or second cousin. That included my Uncle Rabbit and my Aunt Seneva and their children, who live about half a mile or so up the road from us. On this particular afternoon, it was a Saturday. I'm almost certain about 15 of us children were outside my Aunt Seneva's house playing in her dirt yard. The sky began clouding over, the wind started picking up. Lightning flashed far off in the distance, and suddenly I wasn't thinking about playing anymore. I was terrified. I had already seen what lightning could do. I'd seen fields catch on fire after a hit to a haystack. I'd watched trees actually explode when a bolt of lightning struck them, the sap inside rising to an instant boil, the trunk swelling until it burst its bark. The sight of those strips of pine bark snaking through the air like ribbons was both fascinating and horrifying. Lightning terrified me, but so did thunder. My mother used to gather us around her whenever we heard thunder, and she'd tell us to hush. Be still now, because God was doing his work. That was what thunder was, my mother said. It was the sound of God doing his work. But my mother wasn't with us on this particular afternoon. Aunt Seneva was the only adult around, and as the sky blackened and the wind grew stronger, she herded us all inside. Her house was not the biggest place around, and it seemed even smaller with so many children squeezed inside. All of the shouting and laughter had been going on earlier outside had stopped. The wind was howling now, and the house was starting to shake. We were scared. Aunt Seneva was scared, and then it got worse. Now the house was beginning to sway. The wood plank flooring beneath us began to bend, and then a corner of the room started lifting up. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. None of us could. The storm was actually pulling the house toward the sky, with us inside it. That was when Aunt Seneva told us to clasp hands. Line up and hold hands, she said, and we did as we were told. Then she had us walk as a group toward the corner of the room that was rising. From the kitchen to the front of the house we walked, the wind screaming outside, sheets of rain beating on the tin roof. Then we walked back to the other direction as the other end of the house began to lift. And so it went, back and forth, 15 children walking with the wind, holding that trembling house down with the weight of our small bodies. More than half a century has passed since that day, and it has struck me more than once over those many years that our society is not unlike the children in that house. Rocked again and again by the winds of one storm or another, the walls around us seeming at times as if they might fly apart. It seemed that way in the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement, when America itself felt as if it might burst at the seams, so much tension, so many storms. But the people of conscience never left the house. They never ran away. They stayed, they came together, and they did the best they could, clasping hands and moving toward the corner of the house that was the weakest. And then another corner would lift, and we would go there. And eventually, inevitably, the storm would settle, and the house would still stand. But we knew another storm would come, and we would have to do it all over again. And we did, and we still do, all of us, you and I. Children holding hands, walking with the wind. That's America to me, not just the movement for civil rights, but the endless struggle to respond with decency, dignity, and a sense of brotherhood to all the challenges that face us as a nation as a whole. That is the story, in essence, of my life, of the path to which I've been committed since I turned from a boy to a man, and to which I remain committed today. It is a path that extends beyond the issue of race alone, and beyond class as well, and gender and age, and every other distinction that tends to separate us as human beings rather than bring us together. That path involves nothing less than the pursuit of the most precious and pure concept I've ever known, an ideal I discovered as a young man and that has guided me like a beacon ever since, a concept called the beloved community. Let me tell you how I came to understand that concept, how it ushered me into the heart of the most meaningful and monumental movement of this American century, and how it might steer us all where we deserve to go next. What a powerful story, isn't it? I don't know about you, but it speaks to me and us on so many levels. I think of these brave little children. I think of the wind, the house, and all it represents today. I imagine my little nephew, Elliot, who's 4 years old. 4 years old today, by the way. Happy birthday, buddy. I love you. and my niece Daisy, who's almost 3, holding hands with a group of 10 other kids, courageously moving to the weakest parts of this old house, holding down the floor with their little bodies hand in hand as the wind threatens to carry them and their house away. Maybe it makes you think of your kids and your grandkids. Or maybe you can relate to the story of this Alabama windstorm because, like John Lewis, you're feeling the tension in the air. You're witnessing the floorboards bending. Maybe it feels like the world is bursting at the seams. Maybe it feels like things are going to fall apart. It's been storm after storm lately, hasn't it? Crisis after crisis after crisis, and new thing after new thing. There's so much change in the wind. Maybe for you, it's personal life stuff as well, in combination with quarantine, global and national crisis, mix in heartbreaking tragedy, collective outrage. It all makes for a troubling collusion of different storm systems into one big hurricane. Maybe your mental health has been suffering and you're losing your patience with people, or you're wondering if you should blow up your life and try something different. Or maybe you've lost a loved one through the pandemic and your grief is mixed in there somewhere with everything else. Whatever you're contending with right now, I'd like to ask you where the wind is signaling you to walk. What part of your house needs the weight of your attention? Now, interestingly, Jesus actually taught us to be born of the wind. In John 3:8, Jesus said, "The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going." So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Now, did you know this word here for spirit in the original Greek manuscript of the gospel is the word used for wind? Jesus' words can literally be translated, "So it is with everyone who is born of the wind." The translators knew that Jesus was using the wind as a metaphor for the movement of God in the world, the Holy Spirit. And it's unpredictable. It's unharnessed. It's unmanageable. But you see its signs everywhere. In the case of our story, the wind, although it was scary, also showed which parts of the house needed their attention. What does the wind have to show us in our time? What does Jesus have to say to us as our wind, our teacher, our guide? We are disciples after all, are we not? Discipleship means simply to follow a teacher, to walk with the teacher. And I'm convinced that relearning Jesus is relearning discipleship. And it's crucial to navigating the complex times that we live. There are lots of people who know lots of stuff about God, but not a lot of people who know how to walk with the wind. The wind-walking discipleship path is for the sake of developing a strong foundation that can experience both God and disruption at the same time. People that continue to love God and love others well in the midst of whatever global, cultural, or personal storms we are facing. John Lewis's story about his childhood and his words are not unlike a metaphor Jesus used to conclude the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 27. Jesus says, "Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Now, what if the first thing Jesus teaches us about walking with the wind is not about just doing more and being a better Christian, but he teaches us it's actually about exposing the inadequacy of our existing foundations. There are many different economic, historical, and societal foundations that we've leaned on, but are now being questioned and being challenged. Many people today are upset and fearful because things are changing. Foundations are being uprooted and challenged, and folks are frightened to lose their way of life amidst all of these changes. But Jesus asks us a difficult question in the midst of our fears. If the wind and the rain can take it away, was it a good foundation to begin with? If it was Jesus's foundation, it ain't going nowhere. So if your floors are being cracked and lifted by the winds of change, maybe it's time for a new house. Maybe it's time for some renovations. Maybe it's time for a new foundation, a new way. Maybe you've been focused on the wrong stuff and it's coming to a head. It's turning out to be weaker foundations than you thought. Maybe it had all the language of God and Jesus, but at the end of the day, it was more about your politics, your comforts, your biases, your privileges, than it was about being formed by Jesus' teachings as a disciple. Now, Jesus is also showing us in Matthew 7 the type of foundation that can withstand the storms. And he says it's through learning his way of life as our teacher, following his example, and most of all, by not just hearing it, but by putting it into practice. Sometimes it's helpful to reflect on what Jesus doesn't say. Notice how he doesn't say, everyone who has the right opinions has a good foundation, or everyone who is passionate enough about God has a good foundation. It says, everyone who puts my words into practice has a good foundation. If you are practicing Jesus' teachings, if you're doing what he said to do, living how he showed you how to live, you are building a foundation that can get through the storms of our times and provide shelter for anyone seeking refuge. It doesn't mean that we won't have hard times. It doesn't mean that we won't be depressed. It doesn't mean that we won't struggle. It means that the foundation that we stand on, that we live on when we experience those things, will not be shifted. The teaching put into practice Jesus was referring to here is the previous 2 chapters of Matthew 5-7, known as the Sermon on the Mount. They contain these famous Jesus sayings like the Beatitudes and expanded teachings on Old Testament law. And without even reading those chapters, you're probably familiar with a number of the words and the statements and the pithy sayings of Matthew 5-7. For example, Jesus said, blessed are the poor, or blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are the merciful. You are the salt of the earth. You are a light on a hill. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Very familiar. Or you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I tell you, love your enemies. If you have hated someone in your heart, you are guilty of murder. If you have lusted over someone else's partner, you've done the deed in your heart already. Or don't boast of your fasting or your giving or your prayer life. Do it in secret. Jesus also said, turn the other cheek. You cannot serve both God and money. Forgive as we forgive. To the measure that you judge, you will be judged. Don't worry about your life. Your Father sees what you need and cares for you. And then in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus also warns, be careful of the people who claim to speak for God or claim to have authority over your life. By their fruits, you will know them. Bad fruit comes from a bad tree. Good fruit comes from a good tree. These and many more famous and enduring sayings of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount are the resilient foundation Jesus invites us to build to withstand the storms that will come our way. There is something secure and foundational about these tried and tested, lived ethical practices. And over thousands of years, people have nurtured resiliency and fortitude through following the teachings of Jesus. It could be summarized this way. It is learning to experience disruption without being washed away. That is the pathway of discipleship that Jesus shows us in Matthew 7, learning to experience disruption without being washed away. Now, let me say, all of life is grace. And God's love, Christ's love, is so enduring and strong that even when we do struggle and screw it up, it doesn't change our relationship and our standing with God. But it also doesn't end there. God has given us a way to walk, given us an ethic, a pattern of life, to be a lighthouse, a firm shelter, to be life that resembles Jesus and reflects the dream that God has for the world, one of healing and restoration. And the Sermon on the Mount gives us a window into this dream as something livable and practical and resilient. Following and living in the teachings of Jesus is not a means to get God's blessing. You already have it, my friends. It's the way of expressing and living out God's blessing in the world. There's one particular ethic, one theme, one concept, one practice. Both Jesus of Nazareth and John Robert of Tulsa, Alabama, remind us when it comes to walking with the wind. If we want to walk with the wind, we need to know about beloved community. The beloved community, I'm convinced, is how to have that good foundation that Jesus teaches as we weather the storms that are before us and not lose heart. See, our faith is personal, but it should never be private. Faith is meant to be humbly lived together as a loving community where no one is left behind. Individualism has been a big problem in our society and in the church. The church has talked about my personal relationship with Jesus or my private faith. Keep your thoughts, your faith to yourself. I'll keep mine to myself. None of us will talk about it. Or keep your thoughts and feelings to yourself. Don't upset the apple cart. Don't experience differences. Don't work through conflict. There is no conflict because we're all just individuals. No, that the beloved community is a community that engages together, wrestles together, struggles together, and discovers the beloved heart of God in one another and discovers the love that's poured out to us in the Spirit of God through practicing it together, practicing the faith together. See, the individualism is foreign to the world of the scriptures. In the Bible, belief has always meant to be expressed and understood as communal, as a community event. That love in itself is communal in nature. Love cannot be practiced outside of community relationships. That prayer is even communal. God's self is also communal. Think about it. Father, Son, Holy Spirit in one life-giving, self-giving relationship. Take the Lord's Prayer, for example, from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6. Many of us know it by heart, but few of us reflect closely on what we're actually saying. Notice that when Jesus teaches us this prayer in Matthew 6, it says, "Our Father in heaven," not "my Father in heaven." It says, "Give us our daily bread," not "Give me my daily bread." It says, "Forgive us as we forgive," not "Forgive me as I forgive." It says, "Lead us through temptation," not "Lead me through temptation." It says, "Deliver us from evil," not "Deliver me from evil." We cannot separate the us and the me. That we are existing in relationship with one another, with our community, with our friends, with our neighbors, and with our church. And so developing a beloved community then is sometimes counterintuitive because it requires that we move to the weakest and most vulnerable parts of a house. But that house is our societies, our neighborhoods, our communities, our families. That through joining hands, we remove the distance between us and who and where the wind shows us where we need to go and what we need to do. When we all move to that vulnerable section of the house and care for it, we're simultaneously all made safe and protected. Because if one end of the house gets pulled up, the whole thing is going with it. Caring for you means that I'm cared for. We can no longer deny our interdependence. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it has taught us that we are not islands. How I choose to live will impact you, and how you choose to live will impact me. As St. Paul was known to say, one part of the body can't say to another part of the body, "I don't need you." This is the beloved community, a place where no part is forgotten. When we silence or ignore or neglect anyone or any part of society, we're at the same time uprooting and diminishing ourselves. We may not notice at first. We carry on with our lives, putting on the blinders of the suffering of the world and the needs of other people or people that are different than us. But over time, we will feel the impact of neglecting the vulnerable parts of our community as we end up feeling less and less anchored or rooted ourselves. So if that's how you're presently feeling, you're feeling less anchored, you're feeling less rooted in your life, listen to that feeling inside you. It's inviting you to walk with the wind by nurturing beloved community, to go to those forgotten or neglected corners of the house as a way of also caring for yourself because you live in that house too. So I don't know about you, but I can always grow and learn more about what it means to be grounded in beloved community. To keep my house in the ground before it's carried off by another tornado that's ripping through the media. I don't mean to sound like we need to be unaffected. Quite the contrary. Being rooted means that we can be affected deeply and have a foundation strong enough to weather the changes in our society. That Jesus offers us something that he's offered believers throughout hundreds of years, through many different governments, through many different pandemics, through many different societies and upheavals and persecution and plenty, through any politic. Jesus has been offering us a foundation that can weather all of those storms. And it has worked. To conclude our message for today, before his death, John Lewis wrote one last thing and asked for it to be published the day of his funeral in the New York Times. These were his final words. and I give them to you as our commissioning, our benediction, our sending for today. It's called Together You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation by John Lewis, New York Times, July 30th, 2020. Though I am gone, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. While my time here has now come to an end, I want you to know that in the last days and hours of my life, you inspired me. You filled me with hope about the next chapter of the great story when you used your power to make a difference in our society. Millions of people, motivated simply by human compassion, laid down the burdens of division. Around the country and the world, you set aside race and class and age, language and nationality to demand respect for human dignity. Though I may not be here with you, I urge you to answer the highest calling of your heart and stand up for what you truly believe. In my life, I have done all I can to demonstrate that the way of peace, the way of love and nonviolence, is the more excellent way. Now it is your turn to let freedom ring. When historians pick up their pens and write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brothers and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and the power of everlasting love be your guide.